The land was a hard place, made of silence and distance. Out on the vast Dakota prairie, the wind never stopped its work. In summer, it scoured the earth into a fine, choking dust that settled in the lines of a man's face and the folds of a woman's dress. In winter, it was a razor, slicing across the plains with a freight of ice and snow that could bury a house and freeze a man solid to his saddle. The sky was an immense, empty bowl, merciless in its blue glare, and just as unforgiving when it filled with the bruised purple of a coming storm. It was a country that promised a man everything if he could break it. But more often, it was the land that did the breaking. It was into this silence that Caleb Whitaker brought his bride. The wedding was a thing of little note, held on the porch of his ranch house as the autumn sun bled out across the horizon. There was no music, no crowd of well-wishers, just Caleb, the woman named Clara, a circuit preacher whose face was as wind-chapped as the land itself, and an old ranch hand named Silas who stood as witness, his hat held awkwardly over his chest. Caleb stood tall and still, his shoulders broad beneath a clean but faded shirt. He was a man made of the same tough material as the prairie, his features carved by sun and hardship. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, gave away nothing. He said his vows in a low, steady voice that the wind seemed to snatch away as soon as the words were spoken. He had answered an advertisement in an Eastern paper, a simple request for a wife. He needed one to satisfy the terms of the Homestead Act, to turn his claim into a deeded property. A wife was a necessary piece of the puzzle, like a good fence or a deep well. And a wife, the town gossips were starting to say, might keep a man home at night. Clara stood beside him, a small, slight figure engulfed by the vastness of the land. She had come from Pennsylvania, a place of green hills and crowded towns, and the sheer emptiness of this new world was a constant weight upon her. Her wedding dress was her Sunday best, a simple gray wool garment she had sewn herself. Her hands, clutching a small bundle of prairie wildflowers, trembled slightly. She was barely 20, her face still holding the soft roundness of youth, her eyes wide with a desperate hope that was both beautiful and heartbreaking to behold. When she spoke her vows, her voice was a whisper, a fragile thing against the endless sigh of the wind. She looked at Caleb, searching his face for a flicker of warmth, a sign that this was more than a transaction. She found only a quiet, unyielding courtesy. He was not unkind, but he was not there. When the preacher declared them man and wife, Caleb did not kiss her. He simply took her hand, his own calloused and warm, and gave it a brief, formal squeeze. "Welcome home, Clara," he said, and the words felt like an ending, not a beginning. The house was like the man who built it, solid, stark, and stripped of anything unnecessary. The floors were rough-hewn pine, scrubbed clean. The furniture was handmade and sturdy. There were no curtains on the windows, no pictures on the walls. It was a shelter, not a home. Clara set to work at once, pouring all her quiet, anxious energy into softening the edges of their life. She rose before dawn, the chill of the floorboards seeping into her feet, and stoked the fire in the cast-iron stove. The smell of coffee and frying bacon soon filled the small kitchen, a warm and hopeful scent in the cold morning air. She swept and scrubbed, mended Caleb's shirts with tiny, perfect stitches, and planted a small garden near the porch, coaxing stubborn greens from the dry soil. She found a patch of wild sunflowers and put them in a tin can on the dinner table. The bright yellow heads seemed to shout in the quiet room. Caleb noted them with a nod. "That's fine," he said, his voice neutral. He ate everything she cooked without complaint and without praise. He treated her with a careful, measured gentleness that was its own kind of wall. He never raised his voice, never spoke a harsh word. He would pass her the salt, hold a door, or carry the heaviest buckets of water from the well. But his eyes never truly met hers. They looked at her shoulder, at the wall behind her, at the endless prairie beyond the window. He was a ghost in his own house. Clara learned the rhythms of his silence. She learned that he did not wish to speak of his day, of the fences he mended or the cattle he drove. He did not ask about hers. They ate their meals with the scrape of forks on plates as their only conversation. In the evenings, he would sit by the fire, cleaning his rifle or mending a piece of tack, his movements economical and precise. Clara would sit opposite him with her sewing, the lamplight pooling around them, a fragile circle of light in the vast darkness. Sometimes, the silence between them was so heavy she felt she could not breathe. She would ache with unspoken questions, with a longing so sharp it felt like a physical pain in her chest. She wanted to ask him what he thought of the sunset, if he had ever been lonely, if he was glad she was here. But the stillness in his face was a closed door, and she did not have the courage to knock. At night, he was just as distant. He would come to their bed long after she had retired, slipping under the covers with a quietness that was almost apologetic. He would lie on his side of the mattress, his back a rigid line, a gulf of cold linen between them. Clara would lie awake, her body tense, pretending to be asleep. She yearned for him to turn over, to reach for her, to offer a simple touch that would acknowledge her as more than the woman who cooked his meals and shared his name. It never happened. He was a stranger sleeping beside her, his breath even and slow as he drifted into a sleep that she could not share. It was in that second week of their marriage that she first realized he was gone. She had drifted into a light, troubled sleep, and a sound from outside the window. The low nicker of a horse had pulled her awake. The space beside her in the bed was empty and cold. A sliver of moonlight cut across the floor, illuminating a trail of dust motes. She sat up, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She crept to the window and peered out into the moon-washed landscape. A lone figure on horseback was moving away from the ranch, a dark silhouette against the silvered grass. It was Caleb. She watched until he disappeared over a low rise, a speck swallowed by the immense, indifferent night. He was back before sunrise. She heard the soft thud of his boots on the porch, the quiet click of the door. He moved through the house with the stealth of a predator, and when he slid back into bed, the air around him was sharp with the frozen scent of the outdoors. She lay perfectly still, her eyes squeezed shut, her body rigid with 1,000 questions she was too afraid to ask. It became his ritual. Every night, without fail, he would wait. He would sit in his chair, his head leaned back, his eyes closed, listening. Clara learned to make her own breathing slow and deep, to feign the heavy stillness of sleep. Only then would he move. The routine was always the same. The soft scrape of his chair, the careful tread of his boots across the floor, the metallic whisper of the door latch. Then, the silence of his absence would flood the house, a presence more powerful than his had ever been. At first, she made excuses for him. He was checking on a sick calf. He was riding the fence line, looking for breaks. Perhaps he had business in town, though no sane man would ride 20 miles in the dead of winter night for anything short of a fire or a death. But the excuses grew thin, worn away by the nightly repetition of his leaving. A cold dread began to coil in her stomach. It was a feeling she recognized, the same feeling of being an outsider, an inconvenience, that she had known as an orphan living on the charity of relatives. She had thought marriage would be a cure for that loneliness. Instead, it had given it a new and sharper shape. Caleb's trail did not lead toward town. It led north, into the broken, hilly country where the prairie gave way to scrub pine and rocky outcrops. It was a hard ride, treacherous in the dark, and in the deepening winter. It was madness. The path was little more than a game trail, winding through gullies and over ridges where the wind howled like a hungry wolf. His horse, a sturdy buckskin named Dust Devil, knew the way by heart. Caleb rode with his head down, the collar of his sheepskin coat turned up against the biting cold, his thoughts a grim, silent company. His destination was a small, isolated cabin tucked into a hollow, sheltered from the worst of the wind by a stand of gnarled cottonwoods. It was little more than a single room, built of rough logs chinked with mud and moss. But its window glowed with the warm, steady light of a single lantern. That light was a beacon, the only star in his dark world. He would swing down from his saddle before he reached the door, the weariness of the ride and the day settling deep into his bones. He would stand there for a moment, the cold seeping through his clothes, gathering himself before he knocked. The door would open, and Loretta would be there. She was not a young woman. She was perhaps 10 years older than Caleb, and a lifetime older than Clara. Her face was a map of a hard life, etched with fine lines around her eyes and mouth. Loss had carved hollows beneath her cheekbones, but it had not been able to touch the fierce, unyielding light in her dark eyes. Her hair, the color of night, was woven into a thick braid that fell over her shoulder. She was beautiful, but it was not the soft, untouched beauty of a girl. It was the beauty of a weathered rock, of a tree that had survived lightning and drought. It was the beauty of survival. She would look at him, her expression a mixture of anger and resignation. She never seemed surprised to see him. "You should not be here, Caleb," she would say, her voice low and rough, like stones rolling in a riverbed. He would never answer. He would just look at her, his own face a mask of exhaustion and a need so profound it was like a hunger. For a long moment, she would hold her ground, her body blocking the doorway. The tension between them was a physical thing, a taut wire humming in the frozen air. She would search his face, her gaze moving over the hard set of his jaw, the weariness in his eyes, and then, with a sigh that was part frustration and part surrender, she would step aside. "Get in before you freeze to death," she'd mutter, turning her back on him. He would enter, bringing the cold of the night in with him. The cabin was small and cluttered, but it was alive. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. A half-finished basket sat on a small table. Dried herbs hung from the rafters, filling the air with their sharp, earthy scent. It was a place that held the presence of the person who lived in it. Unlike his own house, this one was not silent. It was filled with Loretta's spirit. She would pour him a cup of coffee, black and scalding hot, and hand it to him without a word. He would wrap his numb fingers around the warm tin cup and drink, the heat a small comfort against the chill that went bone deep. They would stand in the flickering firelight, not speaking, the silence between them different from the one he shared with Clara. This was not an empty silence. It was heavy with everything they could not say, with a shared history that bound them together like a chain. "She is a child," Loretta said one night, her back to him as she stared into the flames. "I hear things in town. They say she tries hard." Caleb's jaw tightened. He set his cup down on the mantel. "Leave it be, Loretta." "Leave it be?" She turned on him, her eyes flashing with a sudden, bitter fire. "You bring your trouble here, night after night, and you tell me to leave it be? You made vows. You put a ring on that girl's finger. What did you think would happen?" "I did what I had to do," he said, his voice flat. "And what is this?" she demanded, gesturing around the small cabin, at him, at the space between them. "Is this what you have to do, too? Ride through the snow like a damn fool, risking your neck to come to a place you have no business being?" He took a step toward her, and the anger in her face faltered, replaced by something more vulnerable, something that looked like pain. He reached out and touched her arm. His touch was not gentle or polite. It was desperate, the grip of a drowning man. "This is the only place I can breathe," he whispered, and the confession was torn from him, raw and ragged. Her resistance crumbled. It always did. The hardness in her face softened. The fight went out of her shoulders. She leaned into his touch, her forehead resting against his chest. Her own hands came up to grip his coat, her fingers digging into the thick wool. It was not a tender embrace. It was a collision, a desperate clinging of two people who had found in each other the only shelter they knew from a storm that had already wrecked them. Their passion was a fierce, sorrowful thing. born of shared grief and a terrible, unbreakable bond. It was in the way his hands tangled in her hair, the way she pulled him closer, as if she could absorb him into herself and keep the world at bay. It was a language of touch, because words had long ago failed them. They moved together with the grim intimacy of survivors, seeking not joy, but a momentary oblivion, a brief, sharp, and painful forgetting. There were no soft words, no promises. There was only the heat of the fire, the howl of the wind outside, and the bitter, urgent comfort of each other's bodies. It was tinged with the metallic taste of guilt and the ashes of what they had both lost. Every touch was a betrayal. Every whispered breath was a lie to the girl sleeping miles away. Miles away. In the cold, silent ranch house, Clara lay awake in the empty bed. The moon had moved across the sky, its pale light now falling on Caleb's pillow, on the neatly folded quilt where he should have been. She did not cry. The tears were frozen somewhere deep inside her. She simply stared at the empty space beside her, at the tangible proof of her husband's absence. She could feel him out there, somewhere in the vast, freezing darkness, as surely as she could feel the cold floor beneath her feet. She did not know where he went, or why. She only knew that he belonged to the night, and in his world of shadows. She had no place. The house was her cage, a clean, quiet, and polite prison. His heart was another country, a remote and frozen territory where she was not welcome. And as the first hint of gray dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, she heard the distant sound of a lone horse returning, and she closed her eyes, preparing for another day of silence. The routine of his leaving began to carve a hollow space inside Clara. It was no longer a shock, but a nightly certainty, a punctuation mark at the end of each silent day. She would lie in their bed, listening to the house settle, her ears straining for the signs she now knew by heart: the quiet scrape of his chair on the pine floor, the soft thud of his boots being pulled on, the almost inaudible click of the rifle being lifted from its pegs by the door. A prop, she now suspected, a piece of a story he was telling only to himself. Then the final, quiet snuffing out of the main lamp, and the soft metallic whisper of the door latch. Each time, a cold wave of dread would wash over her. In the first weeks, she had fed herself a steady diet of plausible lies. He was a rancher, and a rancher's work was never done. A fence could come down in the night, letting the cattle wander into a gully. A cougar could be prowling the edges of the herd. He was a vigilant man, a protector of his property. She would picture him riding the perimeter of his land, a lonely, responsible figure under the vast, starry sky, and a small, sad warmth would bloom in her chest. She was the wife of a good, hard-working man. But the lies grew thin and brittle with each passing night. The cold that settled into the plains was a deep and bitter thing now. The ground frozen solid, the wind a constant, keening thief of warmth. No man rode out into that kind of cold night after night unless he was being pulled by a force stronger than reason. The dread in her belly simmered, a low, constant heat. His departures began to feel less like work and more like an escape from her, from the suffocating silence of their house. The hollow space inside her began to fill with a terrible, unnameable fear. A trip to town for flour and salt brought the fear a name. The mercantile was the heart of their small, scattered community, a place of warmth and noise that was both a comfort and a trial. Mrs. Gable, the storekeeper's wife, a woman whose face was a collection of sharp, knowing angles, measured out Clara's flour with deliberate slowness. "Getting mighty cold out your way, I'd imagine," she said, her voice carrying a note of feigned sympathy. "The wind is sharp," Clara answered quietly, keeping her eyes on the sack. A good fire and a good husband are a woman's best comfort in a Dakota winter. Mrs. Gable continued, her eyes flicking toward two other women who were pretending to inspect a bolt of calico nearby. "You're Caleb. He's a good man, works hard, but he always was a lone wolf. even before. Clara felt a prickle of unease. Before? Mrs. Gable sighed, a theatrical sound. Oh, before you came, a man like that, he carries his past around with him like a heavy coat. Some folks say he was never really free to marry. The other two women drifted closer, their faces arranged in masks of neighborly concern. She's right, dear, said one, a Mrs. Pritchard. That business a few years back, it left a mark on him. It's a hard thing for a man to forget a woman who saved his life. A cold fist clenched in Clara's stomach. I don't know what you mean. The widow, of course, Mrs. Gable said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Loretta lives out in the northern hills. Caleb had that terrible accident, broke his leg clean in two. Would have frozen to death for sure if she hadn't found him. Took him in, nursed him for months, all through that awful winter. Some say he never really left. Clara's hands went numb. She fumbled with her coin purse, her fingers suddenly clumsy. She paid for her goods, her face burning, feeling their eyes on her, a mixture of pity and a grim, female satisfaction. She fled the store, her heart hammering against her ribs. The ride home was a blur of wind and gray, desolate landscape. The women's words echoed in her mind, sharp and cruel as pieces of broken glass. A widow, nursed him for months, never really left. The name, Loretta, felt like a stone in her throat. That night, the silence in the house was different. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the ghost of another woman. When Caleb prepared to leave, his ritual seemed less a mystery and more a blatant, painful betrayal. Every movement was a confirmation of the town women's whispers. The dread that had been simmering inside her now boiled over into a sick certainty. The cold did not stop Caleb. It did not stop his nightly pilgrimage, but it was wearing on Loretta. She watched him one night as he stood by her fire, shedding the cold like a second skin. His face grim and set. He looked older than he had a year ago. The lines around his eyes deeper, the quiet in him heavier. You have a bride now, she said, her voice devoid of its usual sharpness, replaced by a profound weariness. She is a good girl. From what I hear, she keeps your house. She warms your bed. Why do you still come to me? Caleb turned from the fire, his expression unreadable. It's not the same. Of course it's not the same, she snapped, the fire returning to her eyes. It's not supposed to be the same. This, she gestured between them, at the small, warm cabin. This was about survival. What you have with her is supposed to be about living. Don't you know the difference? He looked away, his gaze falling on a small, carved wooden bird that sat on the mantelpiece. He had carved it himself during the long, delirious weeks of his recovery, his hands clumsy with fever and pain. It was a clumsy, unfinished thing, but she had kept it. He did not answer her question. He could not. How could he explain that her cabin was the only place the ghosts in his head went quiet? How could he tell her that the bond between them was forged in a fire so terrible that everything else in his life felt like pale moonlight? He remembered the fall, the sudden, sickening lurch as his horse lost its footing on an icy patch of rock, the world turning upside down, the blinding, white-hot explosion of pain in his leg, followed by a darkness that was a mercy. He had woken up to the taste of blood in his mouth, and a cold that was already starting to claim him. He had tried to move, but the shattered bone in his leg had ground together, and he had screamed until he was hoarse, the sound swallowed by the indifferent wind. He knew he was going to die there. He had made his peace with it, closing his eyes and waiting for the cold to finish its work. And then, a face, a woman's face, framed by dark hair, her eyes wide with a fierce, determined light. Loretta. She had found him while checking her traps. How she had gotten him onto that makeshift travois and dragged him back to her cabin, he never knew. It was a miracle of will and strength. He remembered the endless weeks that followed as a blur of pain, fever, and laudanum. He remembered her hands, surprisingly strong, setting the bone as he bit down on a piece of leather until his jaw ached. He remembered her spooning broth into his mouth, her presence a constant, steady anchor in the swirling sea of his delirium. She was his whole world, the one who stood between him and the darkness that was patiently waiting for him. He had not known, not until his fever broke and his mind cleared, about her own tragedy. He had woken one morning to a silence in the cabin that was different, a stillness that was heavy with a fresh and terrible grief. He had called her name, and she had come to his bedside, her face a pale, tear-streaked mask. Her son, a small, quiet boy of 5 named Samuel, had been taken by a fever in the night. The same storm that had kept her from getting a doctor for Caleb had trapped her with her dying child. While she had been tending to the broken stranger in her bed, her own flesh and blood had slipped away. The guilt had been a physical thing, a crushing weight that had settled on his chest and never left. He had lived, and her son had died. There were no words for a thing like that. There was no comfort, no absolution. All they had was the shared, silent landscape of their grief. When he was finally able to walk, he stayed. He chopped her wood, hunted for her, fixed her roof. They lived in that small cabin together, 2 solitary ghosts haunting the shell of a life. Their intimacy had grown not from passion, but from that shared, desolate space. They were 2 people who had looked into the abyss, and they had recognized the same emptiness in each other's eyes. When he touched her, he was touching their shared history, their shared sorrow. He was not making love to a woman. He was clinging to the only other survivor of a shipwreck. Now, standing by her fire, he had no answer for her question. To speak of that time would be to give it a life he could not bear. So he remained silent. That silence was the final confirmation Clara needed. The doubt had festered long enough. She had to know. She had to see. One night, as the moon rose, a cold, perfect circle in the black sky, she made her decision. After Caleb left, she did not stay in the cold bed. She dressed quickly, pulling on her warmest wool coat and wrapping a shawl around her head. Her hands shook as she lit a small lantern. She slipped out of the house, her movements as furtive as her husband's. In the corral, she saddled her own horse, a gentle mare, her fingers stiff and clumsy with cold and fear. She kept a distance, letting Caleb's dark shape be her guide. His horse was faster, more sure-footed, but the trail he left in the thin layer of snow was easy enough to follow. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe, each inhalation a sharp pain in her lungs. The world was utterly silent, save for the crunch of her mare's hooves on the frozen ground and the frantic beating of her own heart. She rode through a landscape of shadows and moonlight, a place of stark, skeletal beauty that felt alien and threatening. She was venturing into his secret world, and she was terrified of what she would find there. After what felt like an eternity, she saw it, a faint, golden light flickering in a hollow between the hills, a single lantern in a window. It was the beacon that drew her husband away from her every night. She dismounted, her legs unsteady, and tethered her horse to a scraggly pine, her movements stiff and automatic. She crept forward on foot, her boots making soft, whispering sounds in the snow. She stopped at the edge of the clearing, her body hidden in the deep shadows of the cottonwood trees. The cabin was small and rough, smoke curling from its stone chimney like a ghostly finger pointing at the sky. And then, the door opened. A woman stood silhouetted in the warm light. She was older, taller than Clara, her hair a dark braid against her shoulder. Caleb was standing before her. Clara could not hear their words, but she could see the tension in their bodies, the invisible lines of force that connected them. She watched as Caleb reached out, his hand touching the woman's arm. She watched as the woman's posture softened, as she leaned into him. And then, as Clara's breath caught in her throat, a frozen, painful knot. She saw Caleb lower his head. He kissed the woman. It was not a long kiss, not a passionate, hungry claiming. It was something quieter, deeper, and infinitely more devastating. It was a kiss of weary familiarity, of profound intimacy. It was the kiss of a man coming home. He stepped inside. The woman followed. The door closed, shutting out the cold, shutting out the night, shutting out Clara. The world seemed to fall away. The wind, the trees, the cold. It all disappeared. There was only a roaring silence in her ears. The scene replayed in her mind. A single, perfect, shattering image. The kiss, the closing door. Her world, which had felt so fragile and uncertain, now lay in ruins at her feet. Every hope she had carried with her from Pennsylvania, every quiet prayer for affection and security, turned to dust and blew away on the bitter wind. She did not scream. She did not cry out. She did not march to that door and demand an answer. A part of her, the part that had been slowly freezing for months, simply went numb. There was nothing to say. She had seen the truth, and the truth was a thing beyond words. She turned and stumbled back to her horse, her movements wooden, her mind a complete and utter blank. The ride home was a dream of cold and shadow. She did not guide the mare. The horse, sensing the way back, plodded steadily onward. When she reached the ranch, the house looked like a stranger's dwelling. She unsaddled the mare, her fingers moving with a memory of their own, and slipped back inside. The house was cold and empty. She walked into the bedroom, the moonlight painting a lonely square on the floor. She looked at the bed, at the smooth, undisturbed quilt on her side, and the rumpled, empty space on his, and then the numbness finally cracked. A single, hot tear slid down her cheek, then another and another. They fell onto her cold hands, onto the pristine quilt of her untouched wedding bed. She sank down onto the mattress, wrapping her arms around herself, and wept in the devastating silence. A solitary mourner for a marriage that had never truly begun. The morning after she saw the kiss, something inside Clara settled into a hard, cold resolve. The tears were gone, frozen in the night, and in their place was a quiet, desperate determination. She would not surrender her husband to a shadow in the hills. She would fight for him, not with accusations or tears, which she knew would be useless against his wall of silence, but with the only weapons she had, her devotion, her hands, and her hope. She began her silent campaign at the breakfast table. Instead of the usual simple fare of bacon and coffee, she woke an hour earlier and made biscuits, light and fluffy, and served them with a jar of wild plum preserves she had found in the pantry. She laid the table with a clean cloth, and even put a sprig of dried lavender beside his plate. When Caleb came in from the cold, he stopped for a fraction of a second, his eyes taking in the scene. He did not comment, but he ate 2 of the biscuits. For Clara, it was a victory as significant as winning a battle. She started to take more care with her appearance. She had always been neat and clean, but now she would pin her dark hair more carefully, trying to coax a curl to lay against her cheek. She wore her one good dress, a dark blue wool with a bit of lace at the collar, even on weekdays. She wanted him to see her, to truly look at her, not as a fixture in the house, but as a woman, his wife. In the evenings, she tried to fill the silence. She would read aloud from the newspaper that came once a week from town, her voice soft but clear, sharing news of the wider world as if it might build a bridge between them. She would ask him questions, small, careful inquiries about his day that required more than a nod or a grunt. Did the north fence hold in the wind? She'd ask. Is the bay mare's cough any better? He would answer, his replies clipped and brief, but he did answer. He would look up from the harness he was mending, his gaze meeting hers for a fleeting second. And in those moments, Clara's hope would flicker to life. She was making progress. She was pulling him back. Caleb was not a blind man. He noticed the changes. He saw the new effort in the meals, the lace at her collar, the hopeful, questioning look in her eyes. And each small, gentle attempt she made to reach him was another hot coal of guilt dropped onto his soul. He saw her trying, with all her quiet might, to be the wife he needed, and he knew he was failing her in the most fundamental way. Her kindness was a judgment. Her patience was a condemnation. The house, which had once been a place of neutral silence, now felt charged with her unspoken plea and his own suffocating shame. The guilt made the pull to Loretta's cabin even stronger. At his own hearth, he was a liar, a ghost playing the part of a husband. He was choking on the unspoken words, drowning in the pretense. The ride through the frozen night was a release, a stripping away of the lie. The further he got from his own front door, the more he felt like himself. The air at Loretta's cabin was thin and sharp, but he could breathe it. He knew it was a sickness, this need for her. He knew he was destroying the innocent girl he had sworn to protect, but he could not stop. Loretta was the keeper of his history, the only other soul who knew the precise shape of his grief. Her presence was an absolution of a kind, a silent acknowledgement that his pain was real. To stop going to her would be to sever a limb. It would be to agree to live in the polite, soul-crushing silence of his marriage forever, and he could not do it. Loretta saw the growing torment in his eyes. She saw the way his shoulders were bowed under a new weight. She had been watching him carry his guilt for years. But this was different. This was sharper. A fresh wound. One night, as a storm gathered in the north, spitting pellets of ice against her window pane, she finally drew the line she had been threatening to draw for months. He stood dripping by her fire, his face etched with a familiar weariness. "This has to end, Caleb," she said, her voice quiet but unyielding. He flinched as if she had struck him. "Loretta, don't—" "No," she said, stepping in front of him, forcing him to meet her gaze. "You listen to me. I have lived with ghosts my whole life, my husbands, my boys. I will not add that young woman to the list. I will not be the stone that grinds her heart to dust. Do you hear me?" "You don't understand," he began, his voice a low growl of desperation. "I understand better than you think," she countered, her voice softening with a sad, bitter wisdom. "I understand a man who is running from a house that feels like a cage. But you built that cage, Caleb. You put her in it. You have a duty to her." She took a deep breath, her own pain a raw thing in her eyes. "I want no part in destroying another woman's life. I've had enough destruction for one lifetime, so this is it. I am telling you now, leave. Go home to your wife, and do not come back here again." Her words hung in the air, final and heavy as coffin nails. He stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief and anguish. He saw the resolve in her eyes, the hard-won strength that had saved his life all those years ago now being used to cast him out. He turned without a word, grabbed his coat, and walked out the door, back into the gathering storm. Loretta stood by the window, watching his dark shape disappear into the swirling snow. Every instinct screamed at her to call him back. Her own loneliness was a vast, cold thing, and he was the only warmth she had known for years. But she held her silence. It was a kindness, she told herself, a cruel, necessary kindness to the girl she had never met. Caleb did not go home. He rode aimlessly for hours, the storm raging around him and inside him. Loretta's words echoed in his mind, a relentless judgment. Go home to your wife. But that house was not a home. It was a monument to his failure. And Clara, with her hopeful eyes and her lace collar, was its priestess. To return to her now, with Loretta's ultimatum ringing in his ears, felt like a surrender he could not make. The storm was a white, howling fury, and he was a fool for being out in it, but the cold was a comfort, a pain that was clean and simple, a distraction from the tangled mess in his soul. He was caught between two homes, and he belonged in neither. Sometime after midnight, his will broke. The horse, sensing his own desire, had already turned. He was going back, just one more time. He had to make her understand. When he stumbled through Loretta's door an hour later, caked in snow and half frozen, the look on her face was one of profound, heartbreaking sorrow. She had not expected him. She had hoped he was stronger. "You fool," she whispered, her anger gone, replaced by a deep, weary resignation. "You damn fool." He did not try to explain. He simply pulled her to him, his frozen hands gripping her with a desperate strength. This time, their passion was not a comfort. It was a frantic, desperate collision, a rage against the end. It was the frantic clutching of two people clinging to a ledge, knowing they were about to fall. They both knew it was the last time, and that knowledge stripped away everything but a raw, aching need that was as much about grief as it was about desire. While Caleb was making his desperate choice, Clara was seeking her own counsel. The next day, after he had returned, colder and more distant than ever, she rode into town. She went to the small house behind the church and knocked on the door of Martha, the circuit preacher's wife. Martha was an older woman, with kind, tired eyes that had seen their share of prairie hardship. Clara sat in her warm, cluttered parlor, a cup of tea steaming in her hands, and haltingly, she told her story. She did not speak of a widow or a cabin. She spoke only of a husband who was a stranger, who left every night and returned at dawn with the frost on his soul. Martha listened patiently, her hands busy with her knitting, the click of the needles a steady, rhythmic comfort. When Clara finished, her voice trailing off into a pained whisper, Martha set down her work. She looked at Clara, her gaze direct but gentle. "My dear," she said, her voice soft, "a woman's heart is a hearth fire. It wants to give warmth, to be the center of the home. But a man's soul is a different creature. A man's soul is like a horse in the night. It runs where it's pulled, not where it's tied." She reached out and patted Clara's hand. "You cannot force a horse to drink, and you cannot force a man's soul to stay where it does not feel it belongs. All you can do is keep the fire burning, and pray he sees the light and finds his way home." The words were meant to be a comfort, but they landed on Clara's heart like stones. They confirmed her deepest fear, that she was powerless. Her love, her efforts, her devotion, they were a piece of rope, and his soul was a wild thing, pulled by a force she could not see or fight. She rode home under a low, gray sky that promised more snow. The storm hit that evening, a blizzard that descended upon the plains with a sudden, violent fury. The wind howled, rattling the windows and driving snow into every crack and crevice of the house. Caleb went out to secure the barn and check on the livestock. When he came back in, his face was red with cold, his eyebrows and mustache thick with ice. They ate their dinner in silence, the storm providing a roaring soundtrack to their quiet misery. After the meal, Caleb put on his heavy coat. Clara's heart stopped. Not tonight, surely not in this storm. "The roof of the lean-to sounded loose," he said, his voice rough, not looking at her. "I'm going to make sure it holds." It was a lie, and they both knew it. He was going. Even in this, the force that pulled him was stronger than a blizzard. She watched him walk out the door and disappear into the blinding white curtain of the snow. Clara did not go to bed. She sat in a chair by the dying fire, a quilt wrapped around her shoulders, and she waited. The hours crawled by. The storm did not abate. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and the house groaned under the weight of the snow. Midnight came and went, then 2 in the morning, then 3. The dread in her belly, once a slow simmer, was now a frantic, icy terror. This was not a normal night. This was a night that killed men. Dawn came, but the storm did not break. The world outside their windows was a churning chaos of white. There was no sign of Caleb. The day passed in a long, slow agony of waiting. The second night came, and still, he did not return. The silence in the house was no longer one of emotional distance. It was the silence of the grave. By the morning of the second day, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world that was buried and transformed. The sun shone on a landscape of immense, glittering drifts, beautiful and deadly. Clara knew she could wait no longer. She saddled her mare, her movements frantic, and rode to their nearest neighbor, Silas, the old ranch hand. When she told him Caleb had been gone for 2 nights, his weathered face creased with worry. In that blow, Lord have mercy! Together, they organized a search party. 4 men, including Silas, bundled in their heaviest coats, their faces grim. They set out from the ranch, their horses struggling through the deep drifts. Clara insisted on going with them, ignoring Silas's protests. They searched all day, their calls swallowed by the vast, muffled silence of the snow. They found the loose boards on the lean-to, a pathetic testament to his lie. They followed his trail as best they could, losing it and finding it again in the wind-scoured clearings. It led north, always north. As dusk began to settle, painting the snow in shades of purple and rose, one of the men pointed. Smoke! It was a thin gray plume, rising from a hollow between the hills. They rode toward it, their hearts heavy with a grim foreboding. They found the cabin, half buried in a drift, a single light glowing in its window. The men dismounted, their expressions a mixture of confusion and suspicion. Silas held up a hand for Clara to stay back, but she slid from her saddle, her legs shaking, and followed him. Silas knocked on the rough-hewn door. It opened, and the widow stood there. Loretta. Her face was pale and drawn, but her eyes were defiant. She looked at the grim faces of the men, and then her gaze fell on Clara. For a moment, the 2 women just stared at each other, the wronged wife and the other woman, their shared tragedy laid bare in the cold evening air. Silas pushed past her into the cabin, and there, on a narrow cot by the fire, was Caleb. He was alive, covered in blankets, his face pale but his eyes open. He was weak, but he was alive. He turned his head and saw Clara standing in the doorway. He saw the search party behind her. He saw the looks on their faces, pity, judgment, scorn. And then he looked back at Clara, at the utter devastation on her face, at the public blooming of a shame she had done nothing to deserve. The secret was out, blown free by the storm, and it lay glittering and cruel on the snow for all the world to see. The ride back to the ranch was a procession of ghosts. 4 men from the search party. Caleb slumped in his saddle, pale and weak, and Clara, riding ramrod straight, her face a frozen mask. No one spoke. The only sounds were the weary plodding of the horses through the deep snow and the squeak of cold leather. The men looked anywhere but at Clara or Caleb. They studied the horizon. They adjusted their hats. They coughed into their gloved hands. They were witnesses to a private shame made brutally public, and their embarrassment was a tangible thing, a suffocating blanket over the small party. Caleb rode with his head down, his gaze fixed on the pommel of his saddle. The blizzard had left him drained, his body racked with a feverish chill. But it was the fire of humiliation that burned hottest. He had been found in her cabin, being nursed by her hand, laid bare for all the world to see. He could feel Clara's presence beside him, a silent, rigid accusation that was more potent than any shouted words. The vast, empty prairie had never felt so small, so crowded with judgment. When they reached the ranch, the men dismounted quickly, their duty done. Silas, his face a roadmap of pity, gave Clara's shoulder a brief, awkward pat. "He'll be all right, Mrs. Just needs rest." It was a kindness that felt like a hot poker to her pride. She nodded, unable to speak, and watched them ride away, carrying her story with them back to town, to their wives, to the warm circle of gossip by the mercantile stove. The story spread like a prairie fire in a dry wind. It was a story too good, too tragic, too scandalous to be kept quiet. Within a week, the entire county knew. They knew that Caleb Whitaker, the quiet rancher, had been found half dead from the storm in the cabin of the widow Loretta. The details were embellished with each telling. Some said he had been there for weeks. Others whispered that the two of them had a child hidden away in those hills. The truth was lost, buried under an avalanche of speculation and righteous condemnation. The town assigned its roles quickly and mercilessly. Loretta was cast as the villain, the seductress in the woods. She was a homewrecker, a black widow who had snared a married man with her strange, lonely ways. Women who had once given her a polite nod in town now turned their backs pointedly, clutching their children's hands as if her very presence were a contagion. Her isolation, once a simple fact of geography, became a prison of public scorn. Caleb was scorned, too, but his judgment was different. The men at the saloon would shake their heads and mutter that he'd made a fool of himself, but it was said with a certain grudging understanding. He was a landowner, a man who had fought in the war, and these things afforded him a layer of protection. He had shown weakness, a failing they could comprehend. He was a fool, but he was their fool. His reputation was tarnished, not shattered. For Clara, there was only pity, and the pity was a cruel and suffocating thing. She became the subject of whispers, of sad, knowing looks. She was the poor little thing, the mail-order bride from the East who was too plain, too quiet, too simple to hold a man like Caleb. Her innocence, the very thing that should have been her shield, was twisted into a mark of her failure. She had done nothing wrong, yet she bore the full weight of the shame. Her trips to the mercantile became a gauntlet of whispers and averted eyes. Mrs. Gable now treated her with an overly solicitous kindness that was more insulting than open contempt. "Anything else I can get for you, dear?" she would coo, her eyes full of a pity that felt like mockery. Clara's reputation was ruined, stained by a sin that was not her own. For 2 weeks after the search party brought him home, Caleb stayed. He was weak at first, the fever from his exposure clinging to him, but Clara nursed him with a cold, efficient detachment. She brought him broth. She changed the linens. She kept the fire stoked. She did her duty. But she did not speak a single word to him that was not necessary for his survival. The silence in the house grew into a living entity, a monstrous, suffocating presence that sat between them at the dinner table and lay between them in their cold bed. Finally, Clara could bear it no longer. The not knowing, the silence, was a poison, and she needed the antidote, no matter how bitter it tasted. One morning, when Caleb was strong enough to be out mending a harness in the barn, she saddled her mare. She did not ride toward town. She rode north. The trail to Loretta's cabin was clear now, a packed-down path of betrayal. When she arrived, she saw the widow outside, chopping wood with a fierce, steady rhythm, her movements full of a contained anger. Loretta stopped when she saw Clara, the axe held loosely in her hand. She did not look surprised. She looked weary, as if she had been expecting this confrontation for a long, long time. Clara dismounted, her legs trembling, but she forced herself to stand straight. She walked toward the other woman, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. This was not a visit of rage. She had no rage left. There was only a vast, empty ache. She stopped a few feet from Loretta. The two women stood in the snow, the silence of the hills broken only by the sigh of the wind in the pines. They were a study in contrasts. Clara, small and pale in her plain wool coat, looking like a lost sparrow. Loretta, tall and weathered, her face framed by her dark braid, looking as rooted to this hard land as the trees themselves. It was Clara who spoke first, her voice quiet but clear, stripped of all emotion. "He still says nothing," she stated it as a fact, a simple, devastating truth. "In our home, there are no words. He eats the food I cook. He sleeps in the bed I make. But he is a ghost. I thought I thought maybe he saved his words for you." She looked at Loretta then, her gaze direct and full of a pain so deep it was bottomless. "He speaks to you, doesn't he?" The question was a plea for an explanation, for a reason, for anything that would make sense of the ruin of her life. She expected a confirmation, a cruel twist of the knife that would at least be the truth. But Loretta's expression was not one of triumph. It was one of shared sorrow. She leaned the axe against the woodpile and shook her head slowly. "No," she said, her voice rough with an old grief. "He speaks to no one." She looked past Clara, toward the distant, empty horizon, as if seeing a ghost only she could perceive. "Caleb doesn't talk. He only aches. He has been aching since the day I met him." In that moment, the enmity between them dissolved, replaced by a strange and terrible understanding. Clara saw the lines of pain around the other woman's eyes, the deep, abiding sorrow that lived there. She was not a victorious seductress. She was another victim of his silence, another soul bound to his pain. They were two women standing on opposite sides of the same chasm, with a broken man at the bottom. Without another word, Clara turned, mounted her horse, and rode away. Caleb's attempt to fix what he had broken was as clumsy and silent as the man himself. He stopped leaving at night. He stayed home. He would sit by the fire in the evenings, oiling his saddle, his presence a heavy, awkward weight in the room. He hoped, in his own unlettered way, that his staying would be enough, that it would be a silent apology, a promise to be the husband he was supposed to be. But it only made everything worse. His physical presence amplified his emotional absence. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with accusation, with the memory of the closing cabin door, with the pitying eyes of the townspeople. His being there, a constant, brooding reminder of his betrayal, was a torment. Clara felt like a ghost in her own home, haunting the edges of a life that was not hers. The polite, empty gestures, his passing her the bread, his bringing in an extra bucket of water, were now insults. They were the hollow charade of a marriage, a play they were both forced to perform in a theater of misery. One night, the fragile thread of Clara's composure finally snapped. She had tried everything else. She had tried kindness. She had tried patience. She had tried dignity. There was only one thing left, one last, desperate appeal to the man she had married. She waited until the house was dark and quiet. He was already in bed, lying on his side, his back to her, a rigid wall of rejection. She rose from her own side of the bed, her heart hammering. She let down her hair, letting it fall over her shoulders, wearing only her thin cotton nightgown. She walked around the bed and knelt beside him. "Caleb," she whispered, her voice trembling. He stiffened but did not turn. She reached out a hesitant hand and touched his shoulder. He was as still as stone. With a surge of desperate courage, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his neck. It was a chaste, trembling kiss, a plea for any kind of connection. For a long moment, he did not move. Then, slowly, with a sigh that sounded more like a surrender than a sound of passion, he rolled onto his back. He allowed it. He did not participate. He did not resist. He simply lay there, his eyes open and staring at the ceiling, as she, with a clumsy, heartbreaking urgency, tried to claim her husband. It was a lonely, silent act, devoid of tenderness, devoid of feeling. It was the most profound rejection she had ever known. When it was over, he said nothing. He simply rolled back onto his side, turning his back to her once more. The tears that came were not hot and cleansing. They were cold, silent tears of utter desolation. She had offered him everything she had, her body, her heart, her last shred of hope, and he had turned away. She was more alone, more unwanted, in that moment than she had ever been in her life. The next morning, she began to pack. She did it quietly, methodically. When Caleb was out of the house, she had a small carpet bag she had brought with her from Pennsylvania. She folded her few dresses, her nightgowns, the worn book of poetry she read sometimes. Each item she placed in the bag was an admission of defeat. She was leaving. There was nothing left here for her but shame and a silence that was colder than a Dakota grave. Caleb, lost in his own world of guilt and confusion, eventually drifted back to the one place he had ever felt understood. He rode north one evening, not with the frantic urgency of before, but with the slow, defeated pace of a man with nowhere else to go. He needed to see her. He needed the silent comfort of her presence. But when he reached the cabin, Loretta met him at the door, her face set like stone. She did not let him in. "You cannot be here, Caleb," she said, her voice low and firm. "Loretta, please," he begged, the word ragged. "I have nowhere else." A flicker of the old pain crossed her face, but her resolve held. "That is a lie you tell yourself," she said, her voice hardening. "You have a home. You have a wife. You have a mess of your own making." She took a step closer, her dark eyes blazing with a fire he had not seen in a long time. It was the fire of a woman who had finally reached her limit. "You came to me all those years ago needing healing," she said, her voice shaking with a suppressed fury. "I gave it to you. I tended to your body and I sat with the ghost in your soul. But now, I am the one bleeding. Your sickness has spread to me, to that girl in your house. You are a storm, Caleb Whitaker, and you leave wreckage wherever you go." She pointed a trembling finger back down the trail he had just ridden. "Go home. Go fix what you broke. Be the man that poor girl married, or have the decency to set her free. Burn it all down to the ground if you have to, but either way, you will not bring your wreckage to my door again. Don't come back." She stepped back and closed the door in his face. The solid thud of the latch sliding into place was the sound of the final door in his world closing, leaving him utterly and completely alone in the unforgiving cold. She left on a Tuesday morning. Before the sun had risen, there was no note, no tearful farewell, no dramatic scene of departure. Her leaving was as quiet and deliberate as her life in that house had been. The night before, after Caleb had fallen into his now solitary and troubled sleep, she had packed her small carpet bag with the few possessions that were truly hers. When the first hint of gray light touched the eastern sky, she rose, dressed, and walked through the silent house one last time. It was clean, as always. She had made the bread the day before, and the faint, yeasty smell still hung in the air. On the kitchen table, scrubbed bare. She placed the thin gold band he had put on her finger. The ring looked small and lost in the center of the vast wooden surface. A final, silent statement. She did not look back as she led her mare out of the corral and rode away. Not north toward the hills, but south, toward the unknown. Clara traveled for a week, sleeping in barns and taking shelter with the occasional kind homesteader's wife, until she reached a small, dusty town called Prairie Ridge. It was little more than a single street clawing a living from the vast emptiness. But it had a new schoolhouse, and it needed a teacher. She presented herself to the town committee, her voice steady, her demeanor composed. They saw a plain, respectable young woman, quiet and educated. They did not see the heartbreak or the shame. They saw a solution to their problem. They hired her. A new life began. "Miss Clara," the children called her, their faces smudged and earnest as they struggled with their letters. She lived in a small room attached to the back of the schoolhouse. It was not much, but it was hers. For the first time in her life, she had a purpose that was entirely her own, a place where she was needed and respected. The work was hard, and the loneliness was a constant companion in the quiet evenings. But it was a clean, honest loneliness. Not the suffocating, shared misery she had known with Caleb. Slowly, day by day, she began to heal. She found a strength in herself she had never known she possessed. The timid, hopeful girl who had arrived on the prairie was being forged into a woman, one who was learning to stand on her own 2 feet, her spine straight and her gaze clear. Caleb found the wedding ring that afternoon. He came in from the barn for his midday meal and found the house utterly still. The stove was cold. The silence was absolute. He called her name, and the sound was swallowed by the emptiness. Then he saw the ring. He stood staring at it for a long time, the silence of the house pressing in on him. No longer a refuge, but a tomb. He walked through the rooms. Her few belongings were gone. The bed was neatly made. The house was in perfect order, an orderly and devastating abandonment. He was alone. For the first time, he understood what that truly meant. Before, he had cultivated solitude, using it as a shield. Now, it was a punishment. The door to Loretta's cabin was closed to him. The door to his own house was now a gaping, empty mouth. He had successfully driven away everyone who had ever tried to reach him. He began to spiral. The ranch, once his pride, began to show his neglect. Fences sagged. The stock grew thin. He ate when he remembered to, mostly cold beans from a can. He drank more than he should. The nights were the worst. The silence he had once inflicted upon Clara now turned on him, echoing with her quiet footsteps, with Loretta's final, damning words. He was haunted not by ghosts, but by the memory of his own failures. One night, sitting at the kitchen table where she had left the ring, a desperate, unfamiliar urge took hold of him. He found a pencil and a few sheets of foolscap. For a man who lived his life through his hands, the act of writing was a foreign and clumsy struggle. His fingers, calloused and thick, cramped around the pencil. But he persisted, driven by the crushing weight of his solitude. He wrote 2 letters. He poured everything he had never been able to say onto the pages. He wrote of the fall, of the cold, of the debt he owed Loretta that was deeper than blood. He wrote of the guilt over her son, a guilt that had frozen his tongue and his heart for years. He wrote of his own cowardice, of his inability to be the man he should have been. It was a raw, artless confession, full of crossed-out words and blunt, painful truths. One letter he addressed to Loretta, the other to Clara, in care of the post office in the town she had come from, hoping it might somehow be forwarded to wherever she had gone. He wrote out the next day and posted them, the act feeling like setting 2 small, desperate boats adrift on a vast and empty ocean. Weeks later, a letter found its way to Loretta's remote cabin. She recognized Caleb's clumsy script at once. She sat by her fire that evening and read his words, her face impassive in the flickering light. He had finally spoken, but it was too late. He had explained the ache she already knew so well. When she was finished, she folded the pages neatly, held them to the fire, and watched them curl into black, weightless ash. She was not being cruel. She was setting them both free. Clara's letter took longer to find her. It was forwarded from her last known address in Pennsylvania and finally arrived in Prairie Ridge. She saw his handwriting on the envelope and her heart gave a painful lurch. For a long moment, she held it, the thin paper a tangible piece of the life she had fled. Her first instinct was to tear it open, to devour the words she had once so desperately longed for. But the woman she was now was more cautious. She had built a fragile peace for herself, and she was terrified of what his words might do to it, with a resolve that surprised even her. She walked to the small chest of drawers in her room and placed the letter inside. Unopened. She would read it when she was ready. She was not ready yet. The arrival that finally broke Caleb's stupor was not a letter, but a man on horseback. His name was Jasper Thorne, a neighboring rancher with a hard face and greedy eyes. He had been watching Caleb's decline with interest. "Whitaker," Thorne said, not bothering to dismount. "Heard your wife left you." Caleb, who was standing on his porch, just stared at him, his face gaunt and unshaven. "The thing is," Thorne continued, a smug look on his face, "the Homestead Act is particular about a man living on the land with his family to prove up a claim. A man whose wife abandons him. Well, some might say his marriage is invalid. Some might say his claim is, too." The threat was clear. Thorne was going to challenge his right to the land, the one thing Caleb had worked his entire life for. the land he had married Clara to secure. The cruel irony of it was a bitter taste in his mouth. "She's my wife," Caleb said, his voice a low growl. "Is she?" Thorne smirked. "Don't look like it from here. The land office might be interested to hear about it." He wheeled his horse around and rode off, leaving Caleb standing in the dust, a cold, sharp fear cutting through the fog of his despair. He had to find her, not just for the land. The thought of losing the ranch was a terrifying spur, but as he saddled his horse, a deeper truth settled in his bones. He had to find her because Thorne's ugly words had made him realize the full extent of what he had done. He had made their marriage a sham, a thing so flimsy a vulture like Thorne could tear it apart. He had to find her because he had chosen silence when she had begged him for words, and he finally understood that his silence had been a weapon, and it had nearly destroyed her. He rode to the town where he had first sent her letter, and after a week of asking questions, of following the faint trail of a quiet woman looking for work, he found his way to Prairie Ridge. He saw her before she saw him. She was standing outside the schoolhouse as the children were leaving for the day, a small, authoritative figure surrounded by their noisy energy. She was smiling, a genuine, unburdened smile. As she helped a little girl with her coat, he saw at once that she was different. The timid, uncertain girl he had married was gone. This woman stood taller. There was a confidence in her posture, a peacefulness in her face he had never seen before. She was whole without him. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He waited until the last child had gone, and then he walked toward her, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. She looked up and saw him, and the smile vanished from her face. She did not look frightened or angry. She just looked still. Her newfound peace was a shield around her. "Clara," he said, his voice rough. He stopped a few feet away, holding his hat in his hands, suddenly feeling like a clumsy, overgrown boy. "Caleb," she replied, her voice even. "What are you doing here?" He started with the lie, the practical reason. "There's trouble with the land claim. A neighbor, Thorne, he's saying our marriage isn't valid since you left. He's making a claim on the north pasture." She listened, her expression unreadable. This was the kind of problem he understood, a problem of fences and laws. But as he spoke the words, they tasted like ash in his mouth. He trailed off, the excuse suddenly seeming pathetic and small. He looked at her, at the woman she had become in spite of him. "That's not the real reason I'm here," he said, the truth finally breaking free. "I came because I finally understood, back at the house, when you tried to talk to me, when you asked me questions, I gave you nothing. I chose silence when you begged me for words. I was a coward. I hid from you. I hid from everything. I'm here to ask you to come home." She listened to his confession without flinching. The desperate, pleading girl was gone, and in her place was a woman who weighed his words with a calm, unnerving gravity. She was the judge now. He was the one on trial. When he finished, she was silent for a long moment. "A lot of words, Caleb," she finally said, her voice soft but edged with steel. "After so much silence." She looked him in the eye, and he saw not just her pain, but her strength. She would not be broken again. "I have to ask you something, and I want the truth. No more hiding." "Anything," he whispered. Her gaze was unwavering. "Do you love her, the widow?" The question was a clean, sharp blade to his heart. He could have lied. He could have said it was just a debt, a comfort, a ghost. But he had come here to speak the truth. He owed her that much. He met her eyes and gave her the only thing he had left, his honesty. "Yes," he said, the word costing him everything. She flinched, a barely perceptible tightening around her eyes, but she did not look away. She had expected it, but the truth still had the power to wound. She took a slow, steadying breath. Then she asked the second, harder question. "Do you love me?" He looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time. He saw the woman she was, the strength she had found, the grace she possessed. He saw the ruins of what they could have been, and in the rubble, a single, fragile seed of possibility. He could not lie to her. He could not give her the simple, easy answer she might have once wanted. He gave her the most honest, painful, and hopeful thing he had ever said in his life. "I could," he whispered. The words hung in the cold air between them, a promise and a heartbreak all at once. It was not enough, but it was not nothing. Clara did not give him an answer. She simply looked at him, a universe of thought and pain and consideration in her eyes. Then she nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture. "You should go now. Caleb, the children will be here soon for the morning." He understood. The decision was hers, and she would make it in her own time. He had said his piece. He had broken his silence. He had laid his heart, or what was left of it, at her feet. He put his hat back on his head, turned, and walked back to his horse. He rode away from Prairie Ridge, away from the schoolhouse, away from the new woman his wife had become. He rode back toward his empty ranch, accepting that he had likely lost the land, that he had likely lost her, that he had likely lost everything. And yet, for the first time in years, he felt the slightest, faintest whisper of peace. He had finally told the truth. The ride back from Prairie Ridge was long and silent, a journey through a landscape that mirrored the desolation in Caleb's own heart. He returned to an empty house and the looming threat of Jasper Thorne. But the fear of losing his land was now a dull ache compared to the sharper, more immediate pain of his own making. He had spoken the truth to Clara, and in return, she had given him silence. It was a silence he had earned, and he knew it. He went about his chores with a grim, mechanical resolve. The ranch a kind of purgatory where he served out his penance one mended fence post, one broken trough at a time. A week passed. The nights were long and moonless. One evening, a restless energy took hold of him, a feeling of unease so strong it was a physical itch under his skin. He saddled Dust Devil, not knowing where he was going, only that he could not bear the crushing silence of the house for another minute. He let the horse choose its own path, and it was no surprise when he found himself on the familiar trail leading north. Into the hills. He was not going to her cabin. He knew that door was closed to him. He was just drawn to the territory, to the landscape that held so much of his past. As he neared the hollow where she lived, the smell of wood smoke was thick in the air, but it was mixed with something else. The sharp, acrid scent of cheap whiskey and something that smelled like fear. A low, guttural laugh cut through the night, followed by the sound of splintering wood. Caleb's blood ran cold. He spurred Dust Devil into a gallop, his heart hammering against his ribs. He broke through the trees into the clearing and saw a nightmare illuminated by the light spilling from Loretta's shattered doorway. Two men, their faces ugly in the lantern light, had her backed against the wall of her own home. One held her arms pinned, while the other, his breath pluming in the cold, tore at the collar of her dress. Her cabin was in shambles, furniture overturned, the contents of her life strewn across the floor. Loretta was fighting, her face a mask of fury and terror, a wild, cornered thing. "Leave her alone!" Caleb's voice was a roar, a sound torn from the deepest part of his soul. The men turned, startled. They had not expected anyone to come to the aid of the town pariah. Seeing Caleb, the man they blamed for their own wives' gossip and scorn, their surprise turned to a drunken, malicious glee. "Well, look what we have here," the one holding Loretta sneered. "Come to join the party. Whitaker, we're just teaching the witch a lesson about breaking up good homes." Caleb was off his horse before it had fully stopped, a cold, killing rage settling over him. He did not speak again. He moved with a speed and brutality the men were not prepared for. The years of back-breaking work, of silent, repressed anger, all found their release in his fists. He broke the first man's nose with a single, sickening crunch. The man released Loretta and staggered back, blood pouring down his face. The second came at him with a knife, but Caleb was faster, catching his wrist and twisting it until the man shrieked and the blade clattered to the frozen ground. He drove his knee into the man's gut, then threw him into the snow like a sack of grain. They were cowards, faced with a sober, furious man. Their drunken courage evaporated. They scrambled to their feet, clutching their wounds, and stumbled away into the darkness, leaving a trail of curses and threats behind them. Caleb stood breathing heavily in the wreck of the clearing, his knuckles raw and bleeding. The rage left him as quickly as it had come, replaced by a wave of nausea and self-loathing. He was too late. He had fought them off, but he had not been there to stop it from starting. He had brought this on her, his sin, her punishment. He turned to Loretta. She had sunk to her knees, her arms wrapped around herself, her dress torn at the shoulder. She was shaking, not from the cold, but from a deep, soul-shaking shock. Her fierce eyes were wide with a terror that broke his heart. He knelt in front of her, his hands hovering, afraid to touch her, afraid of causing more pain. "Loretta," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I am so sorry." She looked at him, and, for the first time, he saw not a survivor, not a pillar of strength, but a woman utterly broken. He gathered her into his arms, as gently as he knew how, and held her as the great, wrenching sobs finally broke through. This time, the roles were reversed. He was the caregiver, she the one in need of healing. He brought her inside, righted a chair, and sat her by the fire. He tended to her cuts and bruises with a tenderness he did not know he possessed. He cleaned the gash on her forehead, his rough fingers surprisingly gentle. He found a blanket and wrapped it around her trembling shoulders. He moved about the cabin, methodically cleaning up the mess, putting her world back in order piece by piece. For the first time, he was not taking comfort from her. He was offering it. He stayed for 3 days. He cooked for her, kept the fire going, and sat with her through the long, silent nights, his presence a steady, protective watch. He nursed her back not just from her physical wounds, but from the deeper wound of the violation. Slowly, the fierce light began to return to her eyes. The shaking stopped. She was a survivor, and her spirit, though battered, would not be broken. On the 3rd morning, as he handed her a cup of coffee, he knew he had to ask. The thought of leaving her here alone, a target for the town's hatred, was unbearable. "Leave this place. Loretta," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Come with me. We can go west, to Oregon, or north to the mountains. Somewhere no one knows us. We can start over." It was a desperate plea, an offer of the only future he could imagine. She looked at him, her gaze clear and steady. She reached out and touched the back of his hand, a gesture of quiet finality. "This is my home, Caleb." "This place almost killed you," he protested. "The people here, they hate you because of me." "Maybe," she said, her voice soft. "But my life is here, not just the bad parts." She looked past him, toward the single small window that faced the hills. "My boy is buried on that ridge. I sing to him sometimes. When the wind is right, I will not leave him. I belong to this land, the same way he does. It's where my heart is buried." He saw the truth in her eyes. Her roots in this hard soil were deeper than his, anchored by a grief he could only witness, not share. She was choosing her own path, one of memory and solitude and a strength he could only admire. She was choosing to stay. He rode away from her cabin for the last time with a heart that was both heavy and strangely light. He knew what he had to do. His final journey was to Prairie Ridge. He did not go to the schoolhouse this time, but to the small office of the town's only lawyer. He spent an hour with the man, signing papers, his hand steady. Then, he went to find Clara. He found her walking by the small creek at the edge of town, enjoying the last of the afternoon sun. She saw him coming and waited, her posture calm, betraying nothing. He did not ask her to come back. He did not speak of the land claim or Jasper Thorne. He simply walked up to her and held out a folded legal document. "This is for you," he said quietly. She took it, her brow furrowed in confusion. She unfolded it and read. It was a deed. He had legally divided the ranch. He had given her half of everything: the house, the north pasture, the best grazing land. It was hers, free and clear, to do with as she pleased. It was an act of justice, an apology written in the language of the land. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a confusion of emotions. "Why?" "Because it's right," he said. "It was supposed to be your home, your security. I failed you in that. I failed you in everything. But I can do this. I can give you what is yours by right." He looked at her, the woman he had wronged so terribly, and offered his final, painful truth. "I am letting you go, Clara. You are free." He turned and walked away without another word, leaving her standing by the creek with the proof of her freedom in her hands. That evening, in her small room behind the schoolhouse, Clara finally took his letter from the drawer. Her hands trembled as she opened it. She read his clumsy, heartfelt words, his confession of pain, of guilt, of a bond forged in a tragedy that was not hers. She read of his cowardice and his regret, and for the first time, she understood the ache he had carried, the silence that was not an absence of feeling, but a prison of it. Tears streamed down her face. She cried for the girl she had been, for the love she had so desperately wanted. She cried for him, for the lonely, broken man she had married. But when the tears subsided, a small, faint smile touched her lips. She would not go back. Her new life, the one she had built for herself, was too precious. But she could forgive. She could finally let go of the bitterness. In his act of giving her the land, he had also given her back her own heart, unburdened. Weeks later, as the sun set over the northern hills, Loretta stood on her porch. She was watching the horizon when she saw a rider, a familiar silhouette against the bruised purple sky. It was Caleb. He was on the main trail, the one that led west, away from the territory, away from everything he had known. He rode past the turnoff to her cabin. He did not slow down. He did not look over. He just kept riding, a steady, solitary figure moving toward a new life. She watched until he was a tiny speck, and then she turned and went back inside her home, at peace. The final scene is of Caleb, alone on the vast and empty plain. The sky above him is immense, a canvas of fire and shadow. The wind, his old, constant companion, whispers through the prairie grass. He is a solitary figure in a bleak, beautiful landscape, a man no longer running from his past, but carrying it with him. He is haunted, but he is freer. He carries 2 loves, 2 regrets, and 1 heart, scarred and broken, that is finally, slowly, learning how to live. Thank you for listening to our tale around the campfire. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from, so we can all connect with folks from different corners of the world. Please subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.